Welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today, I have back on the show crowd's favorite, Dr. Warwick Powell from Australia. Dr. Powell just came back from his trip in China. Last time I talked to you was when you were on a high-speed train, and it's good to have you back because a lot had happened since last time we talked. I mean, it's only been 2 weeks, but now we had a ceasefire, we had we had a blockade on a blockade, and now Trump just announced today that he's going to extend the ceasefire. I'm sure we have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
Which topic would you like to start with?
Well, look, before we dive into the situation in Iran, perhaps I'll just share a few reflections on my 3.5 weeks in China, actually.
I think that would be great.
The trip was partly a family trip to visit family and friends who we haven't seen for a couple of years, and to connect. And of course, part of that, I squeezed in some work-related meetings and travelled to one or two places that had perhaps some interest for the other members of the family, but also I think I found them interesting too. So there's one thing that I think is abundantly clear when you travel around the country, and that is that China remains, in a broad sense, so this is a generalization, a country with a steely determination that comes from a continued desire to improve the quality of not only the lives of individuals and their families, but to improve the quality and conditions of the country itself, whether it's through infrastructure or through ecological repair and those sorts of things. And whether they were people in private enterprise, higher education, think tanks, public policy makers, analysts, right across the industry spectrum, there was a steely determination. They clearly understand that the world at the moment is a pretty unstable place, and that there are, as a result, many challenges, but nonetheless, the belief that the ingredients, if you will, that have served China well over the last 80 years, and particularly since reforming and opening up, will continue to be foundational. The reserves of determination, hard work, a willingness to be open-minded, to explore, to connect, and those sorts of things. So that was one. More specifically, the other impressions that I got were really related to system transformations, and perhaps that relates to some of my own research interests and biases. But I think there are three things that are intertwining with each other. One is again a focus on industrial upgrading, but industrial upgrading in a very particular way, which is to embed systems that enable better and faster decision making, so that there is greater efficiency both in production but also in the circulations of goods and people and things throughout the economic system. The second thing is a clear emergence, I think, of a services sensibility. So the tourist economy, which I got to experience a little bit of when I went to really one of the cores of Chinese civilization in Luoyang, which was where I was heading to on that fast train, was the weekend of the Peony Festival. So the peony is the national flower, and it blooms basically in early April. And the weekend that I was there was for the Peony Festival. It was probably the worst weekend to go, actually, Carl, because I got to experience both the joys and whatever the reverse of the joys are of Chinese tourism with Chinese large-scale characteristics. And I think so. That's a tourism sensibility, and I think the other thing is just the sense of the role of digitalization and information and again, this is a sort of a clumsy English way of describing it, but the intelligentification of the system at large. So it's not about trying to be God with general intelligence. It's actually about a form of practical applied intelligence right across the system to be able to deliver things quicker, reduce the energetic costs of whatever it is that is involved, and to meet the needs of people in a more stable and an orderly way. So it was an interesting time. I visited a couple of tier 1 cities and 3 tier 3 cities and a few smaller places in between. And the other thing that I noticed is that the tier 3 cities are actually growing a little bit. Well, the qualitative responses, if you will, and I think it's backed up by the data as well, is that the dynamism in some of these smaller cities is arguably more intense than it is in, say, Shanghai and Beijing. Shanghai and Beijing are relatively mature urban systems, and whilst there is still work to be done in them, the real sort of verve of Chinese urbanization and industrial renewal and all those sorts of things is to be found away from these big cities, and that was certainly the case in Changzhou, which is a relatively small place in Suzhou, in a couple of places in Anhui, which most people probably wouldn't have heard of, but Anhui is a eastern inland province, about 400 kilometers from Shanghai. And here's a couple of interesting things about Anhui. Anhui has a population that's bigger than France and an economy that's bigger than Argentina's, and nobody's heard of it. And
I remember a Reuters article introducing former Chinese president Hu Jintao. This is more than 10 years ago. It says, it quoted, Mr. Hu came from Anhui, one of the poorest inland Chinese provinces. That's
correct.
how Reuters introduced it. Yeah.
It was, right? So Anhui was known as the land of fish and rice. It's a large part of, well, the northern part is on the lowest plains of the Yangtze River or the Changjiang, and it has been an incredibly important part of the agricultural and food producing regions of Chinese society writ large. But of course, areas that were heavily agriculturally oriented often ended up remaining, somewhat less developed than others. You might recall too, Carl, I mean, you're the history buff, right? And Anhui was one of the places where some of the very early agricultural reforms took place in the early 1980s, experimenting with changes to the household responsibility system, which really led the way, actually, for wholesale policy changes across the country. So this very, very poor province is now, in a sense, experiencing a period of catch-up, and it's catching up through some industrialization. Earlier last year, I actually visited the Chery Motor Vehicle Factory, which is headquartered in a city called Wuhu, which is a third level or tier 3 city, and that factory was producing a motor car every 75 seconds. The city that's probably most well known in Anhui is its capital, which is Hefei. And Hefei became particularly well known as the focal point for Chinese research and development in quantum computing. The university in Hefei established the National Quantum Computing Laboratory at the request of the head of the facility, who came back from the United States from memory to set up the center. In fact, when he came back to China from memory, he was offered the opportunity to have basically the best lab in the world set up in Beijing or Shanghai at one of the top tier universities. And he said, look, I do want to come back. but on one condition only. Of course, you're going to pay for all of these labs and equipment and stuff. He said, but the condition is that it's set up in Hefei, because that's where my parents live and it's my hometown. So, the inland provinces are, in a sense, experiencing, I think, a level of economic dynamism that many people going to the really mature cities, unless they go to the sort of tech parks and the AI places and the robotics places, if you were just sort of wandering the streets of the urban economy, you would probably feel, that sense of frisson and energy that you sort of felt 15 years ago in some of these cities is no longer there. They're a little bit more mature. But when you go to these other places, there's still certainly a lot of focus. There was zero talk, by the way, of the war against Iran and the global oil crisis. China itself, talking to policymakers and researchers and think tankers, whilst sort of generally concerned about instabilities and disruptions, were moderately confident that many of the risk mitigations that had been taking place over the course of the last 15 years, as well as the short-term buffers that have been accumulated over the last 18 months, would see sort of China through. And so far, that has proven to be the case.
Yeah, Chery, which you mentioned, is one of these low-key Chinese automakers that's actually going abroad. I have a friend in South Africa who just bought a Chery car, and like everybody know about BYD, but like there's like a bunch of other Chinese brand like Chery that's also like quite formidable. And people are gonna hear their names a lot more in the coming years. And I believe Chery is like a joint venture between the Hefei government and a local entrepreneur. And
Yeah,
it's one of the success stories coming out
the
of
Wuhu government, actually.
That's right.
So so it didn't even emerge in the capital city of the province, and it was actually from memory, one of the first, if not the first, in effect privately owned or part privately owned automotive manufacturers to be set up in China itself. That was domestic, right? So that didn't involve a foreign joint venture partner. And of course, when it was first established, it was in the business of manufacturing internal combustion engine motor cars, but it has migrated into hybrids as well as pure EV plays. And the EVs that I watched come off the line last year were a sort of a sporty Jeep style four-wheel drive EV, 100% electric, and priced at 99,000 RMB. So
Wow.
folks can divide that by 6.9 for US dollars, or about 4.7 for Australian dollars. Now, let's say roughly 18,000 US dollars, right? For what is in effect a small SUV off-roader, 100% electric, with great performance. So it's interesting too, because many of the EVs that people see and all the ads are very space age, right? And when the guys were designing this particular car, the market feedback that they got was that for an off-road oriented vehicle, people actually wanted a more old-fashioned tactile touch. So instead of a whole bunch of screens and touch buttons, they had to introduce knobs and buttons that actually pressed in, and those sorts of things, and door handles and stuff, just to, because people wanted that analog experience that they kind of associated with a little bit of off-road ruggedness. So it goes to show the design sensibilities of these automakers. They're not just mono-dimensionally pursuing this idea of a space age style lounge room on wheels. These guys designed something that was fit for purpose and very much oriented to a particular set of market sensibilities. Yeah, it's very cool.
Wow. I was actually in China 2 months ago. Just right around Chinese New Year, and I remember one thing that really stuck out for me is how easy it is nowadays to navigate China. Of course, I know Chinese, that helps, but I just downloaded a map in Chinese called 高德地图. It's a mapping app. I pretty much I can go anywhere, without even knowing anything about a city. Just with the map, I can pretty much find anything I want, go anywhere I want using either public transportation or the Didi, the Chinese version of Uber. So it's very very convenient.
Yeah, you're right. And this is really about how information has been harnessed and is integrated into not only a phone, which is how we consume the information, but into or through the phone, through your smartphone, into how you connect with the physical world, right? Transport infrastructure, whether it's the DD, whether it's fast trains or what have you. Because once you've found the place that you want to go to, it's actually very, very easy now to literally call a car that will, take you to where you want to get to. Or if you don't want to do that, it'll actually literally guide you to where you need to go to catch the subways if the city runs a subway. So this practical sense of interfacing these different applications inside an ecosystem does make China increasingly a convenient place. And I guess, again, if you think back 5, 6 years prior to the COVID pandemic, perhaps, there was still a lot of integration challenges between these different things. And for people who don't speak Chinese, I'm like you, I speak Chinese, so in a sense, and read and write Chinese, so in a sense, you're sort of a bit more oblivious to the linguistic challenge, right? But now that with the open visas and that sort of thing, there is an acute awareness that a good experience involves obviously a smooth interactions with these practical things. Nothing worse than not being able to get to where you want to get to. Can't get a car, can't find where you want to go. But also making it not a frustrating experience in terms of the language, right? And all of these apps. So if you had WeChat and you use DD, it's multilingual now. Right? So it's incredibly. It is just an easy place to get around. I mean, look, truth is, 50 odd countries now have visa-free arrangements from China. And look, this sounds like a little bit of a travel blog, right? But uh, you know, go see it with your own eyes. And there'll be things that you like, there'll be things that you find strange and unusual, perhaps interesting, and perhaps you don't like them. But there is nothing better than literally, spending time walking the streets and getting on the trains and getting out amongst it. Because what I think people will discover is that, and this might surprise some people, but probably not so many of your viewers and listeners, Carl, is that China is made up of a whole bunch of ordinary people trying to pursue a good life and to improve the lot for themselves and their families and their communities, and that's largely about it. And and they're committed to doing that. I'm not sure that there's much that's disagreeable about it. And if more people sort of understood that in and of itself is the common destiny, if you will, of people wherever they are, then we might actually find better ways of supporting each other in pursuing those games. So anyway, that's the China plug,
Yeah,
if you
I
will.
mean, yeah, I mean, like China is almost what 20, like 1/5 of humanity, and it's I think it's really odd for people in the West, particularly in US, to think that United States with 5% of the world population is going to forever be dominating the rest of the 95% of the humanity. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And whatever effort they're going to put in to contain the rise of China will be futile, because China has tremendous amount of human capital, and this is just the beginning, because they are ramping up their educational system. Like, like the number of college grads still increasing, the number of STEM grads still increasing year by year. China definitely has still have its best year ahead of it. And all these, contrary to all these copium that's produced in the West about China's coming collapse, or China's economic slowdown, it's just not. It's just copium. It's just copium. But
It
I
is.
expect the copium. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Carl, the copium sort of exists amongst a certain group of people, right? And if you spend too much time in social media, you'll tend to think that is the dominant attitude. But when you start to look at some of the public opinion surveys from around the world, increasingly there is a view that China is a stabilizing force globally, and that countries would be better off finding ways of actually working with and collaborating with China in the pursuit of, shared objectives. And we see these increasingly positive attitudes prevalent amongst younger people, right? So, and this in part comes from travel and being open-minded and those sorts of things. But I think it also speaks to something else, and this is, and maybe sometimes, and I'm not known for this, by the way, but maybe this is a little bit glass half full, that there is a willingness to be actually far more empathetic to others amongst a younger cohort of people in the advanced countries, and particularly a sensibility and an empathy towards the challenges and aspirations of people from the developing world. And that ability to be empathetic, I think, deeply transforms the political posture and the attitudes, right? So often we'll hear in international relations discourse and security discourse, and and some of my work, in a sense, leans towards this, is that there are these powerful material forces at work that in many ways either dictate the terms or drive countries in certain directions. People often say, oh, the conflict between China and America is a structural one. Well, China doesn't see it as a conflict, right? So the conflict in and of itself doesn't emerge from the relationship per se. It emerges from the nature of a relationship viewed through a particular set of framing lenses. And if your framing lens is one that is formed through an attitude of exceptionalism, millenarian superiority, entitlement, a sense of paranoia, etc., then sure, you will view the rise of others as being a threat. You will see the world in very zero-sum game terms, right? That there's a given amount of resource, and if I don't get it, you will. If you get it, it's my loss, etc. But a more empathetic disposition will actually not frame the world at all that way. It will see two large countries, and of course there are many other countries in the world, in a totally different sense. We are still nonetheless talking about the same world, but it's framed through, I guess, a lens that is firstly empathetic to the situation, aspirations of others. But through that, it actually does one other thing, and that is it realizes that the prospects of your own country and your own life is intrinsically and intimately intertwined with the prospects of the lives of others, but not in a zero-sum way. That in fact, the only way of trying to find mutual benefits and progress is to find alignments, right? And in my work as you know, I speak a lot about these issues around sort of energy surpluses, et cetera, et cetera. And what that really means is there is only so much energy in the world, or energy in nature. And the aim really is to enable societies across the globe to harness that energy in more efficient ways that enable them to generate and harness enough surpluses to build and sustain sophisticated, cultural superstructures, if you will. So I think that there is a some shift in attitudes, and the copium stuff, in a sense, is increasingly caught up in the Beltway, number one, and in a much lesser sense, in the United States in particular, it finds its way into the very narrow crevices of a very hardened sort of MAGA constituency. But even within the MAGA constituency, there are aspects that I think that actually understand that their own aspirations for an improved American condition can actually be accomplished by not creating wars on everyone else, right? And so I think that there is perhaps there is something in the air, so to speak, that opens out some better possibilities, notwithstanding the conflicts that are happening, the wars that are happening at the moment, largely caused, incidentally, by a much older generation of people.
Well, let's hope so. Let's talk about the war. Let's talk about the war, because the war is affecting everyone
Yep.
around the globe. The Strait of Hormuz remain mostly closed. Despite Trump's earlier tweets that it was open, and then there's still less than double digits of ships getting through. And there's a double blockade. There's American blockade outside of a Iranian blockade, while the negotiation still goes on. Trump just extended the ceasefire. What what's your take on all this? I mean, because we have talked about
Yeah.
ramifications of this disruption to the global economy. The longer this Strait of Hormuz is closed, the greater impact it will be, because not I think the last ship that have left Persian Gulf before the Strait of Hormuz was closed have now arrived in their destination. That means the real impact is going to be shortly felt in many places. Um, and
Yeah.
even if they were to reach agreement today and try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to take months, maybe 50 days to restore to a pre-war level, both by restoring the energy production and also rerouting all the tanker traffic to continue the supply line.
Yeah.
So we in any case, we're looking at very serious global disruption. What is your
Well,
take on this?
let's look at the economics first. As you say, tankers that left the Gulf prior to the war are now arriving at their destinations. Ever since then, there's been a trickle. So the stock of available crude oil around the world in refineries that use this particular kind of crude will begin to diminish significantly, and that will feed through into the economic systems, and it will feed through in large part through the processes of demand destruction. Activities will stop as prices rise, and those activities um, uh, will take a long time to recover, if they recover, and some of them won't recover at all. So there will be demand destruction. The second thing that it could catalyze is, of course, accelerated moves to reduce economic activities dependencies on the products of crude and the other things. Of course, we've discussed the chemistry and stuff that comes um, out of that region for the rest of the world. So that's your sort of main sort of short-term economic impact. If this war keeps going on for months, and global crude and LNG supplies are in many ways, well, the stock is just structurally collapsed by 15-20%. This will lead to very significant demand destruction globally. There's no two ways about it, and for a very simple reason that there simply is not enough hydrocarbon energy to go around. That's it. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think it's probably worth touching upon is that the recovery, even if things sort of stop today, will take more than 50 days, in part because, and I've read some recent reports that looked at the damage that's been caused to some of the refineries and other facilities in the Gulf. And the estimate says is that it could be 2 to 3 years before some of that is rebuilt. So not all of pre-war capacity will become available again anyway. It's going to, phase in, if you will. So it'll take 2 to 3 years before, in theory, it all comes back on stream. The second thing I think it does is that, and again, I'm just focusing on the logistics and the economics first and foremost, before getting back to the war itself, is that it really shines a spotlight on not only the risks associated with excessive exposure to hydrocarbons, but also the risks associated with maritime interdictions and blockades. Now, many people have gotten very excited in the last sort of week and a half about not only America's blockade of the Iranian blockade, but the visits of the defense minister from Indonesia to the United States, and the execution of a sort of a defense agreement between Indonesia and the US, claiming that the US, by virtue of this, has somehow stitched up the Straits of Malacca. And the sort of geopolitical commentary about all of this is that this is part of the long-run strangulation of China, right? Now, it may well be part of the sort of long-run strategic planning of the United States to try and accomplish this. And we know that going back 20-odd years, this has always been part of the global doctrine that blockades of the Straits of Malacca would be one way in which the United States would seek to contain China, and China was well and truly aware of that. Hu Jintao, who you mentioned earlier, remarked back in 2003 from memory, he coined the idea of the Malacca dilemma. Now, to resolve the Malacca dilemma, China's actually embarked on a number of things. One is that it has progressively transformed the energetic structure of its economy to be far less oil dependent than it once was, number one. The second thing is that it's also transformed the way in which it receives its oil and gas, so that more of it now comes overland than historically did, again, further reducing exposure to maritime interdictions. So much so that Sergei Lavrov last week, whilst he was visiting Beijing, offered and confirmed that Russia had the capacity to offset any losses that China may experience as a result of prolonged blockades of the Straits of Hormuz, and that similarly would apply, of course, to any constraints around the Straits of Malacca. So that's that piece. The third thing that I think is worth bearing in mind is that from a military point of view, interdictions or blockades of the Straits of Malacca is not as simple as people think. So many people, draw lines on maps and put dotted lines around the place and sort of suddenly materialize this sort of blockage. Yet, an effective blockade is obviously one that can be sustained either against challenges to it just simply by powering boats through and calling the bluff, if you will, and this comes with it, the possibilities of a counter threat, which is the ability to either cause some other kind of retaliatory pain, counter coercion, or in fact to respond in military terms itself. And on all of those fronts, China's capacity today compared to 2003 has actually rendered, I think, the so-called Straits of Malacca dilemma as something of a bit of an anachronism. The capacity of the United States Navy to, in a sense, unilaterally uh, close off those straits in the event that they may seek to would be challenged in ways that I don't think the United States could easily withstand. And it would involve significant risks of direct escalation with China, which I would expect actually that the United States would prefer to not provoke, because neither country wants to necessarily activate what could be an escalation spiral towards a nuclear confrontation. Right? So there are actually still significant limits around all of this stuff. So, so I think the excitement's probably a little bit misplaced. The last thing about this excitement that I think is worth bearing in mind is that uh, it assumes that Indonesia rolled over, and I think that that is a misreading of Indonesia itself. Indonesia is the largest economy in ASEAN, as you know, and on the same day that the defense minister was in the United States meeting with the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, the Indonesian president was in Moscow meeting with President Putin. Right. So Indonesia was hedging, quite obviously, but it's hedging in the context of a 70-year position of neutrality. So Indonesia was one of the early, it was a founding signatory to the Bandung statements. It is an anchor nation within ASEAN, and neutrality has actually been pivotal to how these nation states have responded to the geopolitical pressures that have come and gone and impacted on the region from time to time. So I don't see that Indonesia will somehow make its shores available to support, an American blockade effort, let alone make its waters available as well. And probably the last thing I should say is that the Chinese naval development capabilities, together with its missile capabilities and its ongoing enhancements in submarine identification and capabilities, I think radically transforms the material nature of what is at stake now. So again, 20 odd years ago, well, going back to 1996, the United States could take an aircraft carrier down through the Straits of Taiwan with zero capacity for mainland China to respond. I don't think that that's the case anymore. And the last thing about all of this is that, broadly speaking, American capacity in the region is underpinned historically by the fact that it has a lot of bases. Right? So, naval ships need to operate from somewhere because they need replenishment and supply chain support. And I think it is inconceivable now that the United States has a capacity to defend its bases in the region. And I say that because the evidence of the destruction of American bases in the Middle East over the course of the last 40 days tells us that it doesn't have the ability to defend its bases. So in terms of the war itself, what can we say, Carl? There's a couple of ways of interpreting the event itself. And for those who follow this closely, a good way of thinking about this is an ongoing counter-positioning, if you will, of perspectives. One from Robert Pape. He's a professor at University of Chicago who describes this war as a classic example of his theory of the escalation trap. So the theory basically goes that every time one of the parties applies coercive pressure in the hopes of forcing the other side to give in, it leads the other side to counter-respond, leading to escalations, and away you go. And the early phase of the war suggests that this was the case because as the Americans attacked Iran rapidly responded not only in kind but also horizontally, went into attacked the bases across the region, etc., and began escalation. That's one perspective. The other perspective really sees the ceasefire in armed bargaining terms, and it's a view that's been articulated by an analyst based in New York by the name of Anasar Faraki. I've spoken with Anasar on a couple of occasions, and he's known in social media terms by the handle Policy Tensor, Tensor. And his argument is that, and in fact, this is where he is of the same view broadly with Pape, is that the United States has actually lost this war strategically. And instead of, as a result of that, being trapped in this escalation spiral because the United States is trying to, in a sense, coerce its way out. Remember that idea of coercion to peace, right? Forcing peace through strength and all those sorts of ideas. The Anasar Faruqi's argument is that the United States actually understands that it's strategically lost this, that the cost that it would have to incur in an attempt to arm wrestle the control over the Strait of Hormuz from Iran, which would involve a disarming of Iran, is actually impossible, and that the costs are incredibly high, ground troops, etc., and costs to the global economy and the American economy would also be very high. So the United States was forced to the table. And what's happening at the moment is not a performance act to leading to escalation, as Pape would suggest, but is actually a case of armed bargaining, where each side is now seeking to arm twist the other to get better terms. I think that there's a couple of other dynamics that overthrow onto these two sort of broad themes. One is that there is a longer term story here, and that is, of course, American and Israeli strategic ambitions, which is underpinned not only by the politics and economics of oil, but also by a millenarian zealotry that comes with certain ideological and scriptural perspectives that drive attitudes and behaviors amongst some American political elite and Israeli political elite. And this zealotry, in many ways, overrides other considerations. The zealotry associated with Israel is of a very particular kind, but we often see this kind of zealotry amongst the American neocons who, no matter what the state of things are, take the view that they only look bad in the short term because America doesn't commit enough, which of course then leads to further escalations. So I think that there's a medium-term backdrop here, if you will, of this kind of millenarian zealotry. And the last sort of dimension that I'd add to this is an issue that's described as what I've described as the decent interval problem. Now, the decent interval problem was a problem that emerged in the Vietnam War, when those inside the Beltway, inside the Pentagon, State Department and others actually knew quite early on in the piece that the United States was not going to be able to prevail over the North Vietnamese. The problem was how to get out without looking like that they got defeated. And there needed to be a decent interval between the realization that they couldn't win and the exit. And that decent interval was a politically driven interval, which was all about kicking the can of defeat down the road so that a future administration would have to deal with it. And what these dynamics, when you throw them all into the mix, whether it's Pape's escalation trap, whether it's Anasar's sense of strategic coercive bargaining, mix it in with zealotry and the politics of the decent interval problem. And the question now is whether or not zealotry and the decent interval problem, in a sense, overrides what I think in Washington is that there are sane people who realize that this is not winnable. Whether it can or not, whether it leads to America ultimately acceding to many Iranian terms, I guess we'll see. My own gut feeling is that the zealotry, the neocons, the millenarianism, the exceptionalism, the broader regional strategy concerning Greater Israel, the sort of obsessions around containing China, this fear of being seen to be a loser, right? All of that is very powerful as a set of forces that, you know, my own gut feeling is that it will overrun any attempt to pull this this military catastrophe to a close sooner rather than later. And so the United States is in some regards now trapped into a process by which it's going to have to commit more resources, and Iran quite clearly is determined to fight, which leads to a very dark economic prognosis for the next 6 to 12 months. How that we did a yin and yang today, Carl. You know, the first half of our chat was very yang, and the second half was very yin.
Yes, we always have to end on an upbeat note, so let's keep going.
Look, the upside,
so I just want to
you go.
I just want to add the part about the recent agreement between United States and Indonesia, because you know, people are celebrating this as some sort of U.S. Got Indonesian to switch or to flip Indonesia. This is people who are quite ignorant of the Indonesian foreign policy as it's been practiced for the past few decades. Here in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, all these surrounding countries, the general policy is to be enemy of none and to be friends to all. Like, they do not, countries in Southeast Asia do not want to take a side, right? They want to just happily trade with everyone. And what Indonesia is doing is always a balancing act, because there's the United States always pressuring these countries to take a side. It's either with us or against us. But at the same time, all these countries recognize their economic destiny lies with China, with a huge Chinese market next door, and they also need a lot of capital goods, which only come from China. A lot of investment that's only coming from China. So this again, this is just Indonesia doing its thing. It's a balancing act. Just because they signed this agreement, it does not mean any kind of a new strategic alignment of the countries. This is what the countries in this region have been doing for the longest time. They don't want to choose a side. They just want to be left alone mostly and do development. And they have to do occasionally throw some bones to the United States, you know, so it does not get too crazy. That's you know, like, this is. Go ahead.
People need to understand this, right? About ASEAN, broadly speaking, and of course Indonesia, who in some ways, and I don't mean this in a way that disparages the other members of ASEAN, but you know, historically has been first amongst equals. It is the largest economy within the group, and of course has a significant amount of influence, and I think it takes that role actually very seriously. It understands that it is and has been historically a pillar of regional neutrality, and I see absolutely no reason to think that it is making any change to that approach at all. I think some of the consequences of the war in Iran and the war against Iran will eventually feed through into Asia, because on the military dimension aspect, as I mentioned, it clearly shows that the United States actually doesn't have a capacity to defend its bases, and because of that, it actually has lost any meaningful capacity to project deterrence in Asia. That's the big backdrop story. Excuse me. The second thing, though, is that Asian economies, to one extent or another, have been exposed to hydrocarbon risks. And the response has clearly been to accelerate moves to mitigate those risks. Interestingly, some of that, particularly, say, Singaporean refineries, have been quietly bringing in Russian crude. Singapore is actually in a very, very challenging position, even more so, I think, than Indonesia. But the region at large is responding by looking to accelerate electrification. And, to put a very specific face to the capital goods you talk about, we're really talking about renewable energy, clean energy systems, microgrids, EV charging, electric tractors, electric motor scooters, electric bikes, solar power, you name it, more batteries. Did I say batteries? I should say batteries again. More storage, anything and everything that can, as quickly as possible, reduce the risks of the economy to future constraints in the supply of crude oil. And there is really only one player in town. Now, of course, Vietnam has its own EV, champion, which is great. Japan and Korea, of course, have some really leading technical capabilities in some areas, but broadly speaking, this process of electrification acceleration will only mean that the region becomes more integrated with China than less. Now, it'll also create other stresses, Carl, just very, very quickly. People will say getting American bases and all those things out of the region is something that many would see as in a very positive light, and for many good reasons. But we have a couple of other countervailing dimensions now. If the US retrenches in a formal sense a little bit too quickly, it will actually create a bigger window for the Japanese to step in. And NATO itself is looking to, come into Asia via Japan. So there is a bit of a reorganization of some deck chairs, but ultimately in a way that would involve a remilitarized Japan. So the price that's paid for a reduction in American power projection in the region and a clear material reduction in its capacity to project deterrence capability is a window of Japanese remilitarization, which won't be well received, right? So, all of these dynamics have rough edges as well.
Well, unfortunately, I think the remilitarization of Japan is kind of baked in stone now, because one, United States itself actually has been actively pushing for it. They have been actively encouraging remilitarization of Japan because decision makers in Washington have now realized by itself it's no longer able to contain China, so it needs to sign on its Asian quote unquote allies, Japan, Korea. They're trying to shift more responsibility to Japan, like how United States is trying to shift the whole burden of Ukraine war on EU at this point.
Yeah.
And for Japanese part, the current Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, which has sky high popularity, she has really been pushing, for basically to make the Article 9 of the Japan's peace constitution obsolete. The article, for people who don't know, the Article 9 of Japan's peace constitution forbids Japan to deploy its military beyond its borders. And this is something, this has always been seen as a thorn by the right-wing Japanese political factions, because they saw this as a humiliation, a imposed condition on Japan, and they just want to return Japan, quote unquote, to a normal country status, by which they mean to have a powerful military that they can deploy wherever they please. And this is why recently Takaichi just announced they're going to get rid of the ban on export of heavy weaponry outside of Japan. They understand to completely do away with Article 9 of the peace constitution still remain unpopular. So what they do is they they find backdoor ways to break the spirit of Article 9, that to maybe to reinterpret it. Her predecessor Shinzo Abe already did that, to reinterpret the constitution to say, oh, we can deploy our military abroad in terms of emergencies that we have to support our ally, like United States. And then Takaichi more recently said, if something happened to Taiwan, that's an existential threat to Japan that will force Japan to deploy its military. So I think, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's anything stopping the remilitarization of Japan at this point.
No, not at the moment. And I think a way of understanding what's happened practically vis-a-vis the Constitution is that there's been a decade of salami slicing. Yeah, look, and in fact, the window for Japanese remilitarization will expand more as the United States takes a step back. The balancing act for the US is if Japan becomes too big for its boots, it starts to think of itself as a normal nation as opposed to being a foot soldier for the Americans, and that will create its own dilemmas for Washington as well, and of course for other countries within the region. So many of these dynamics come with rough edges or double-edged swords, and the mere fact that the United States is no longer capable of projecting deterrence in the region needs to be interpreted in, I guess, multi-dimensional ways, and there needs to always be a sensibility to the fact that whilst one thing happens that may contribute to it may lead to the removal of a certain cause of instability within a region, does not necessarily mean that the region becomes stable. It might lead to new sources of instability emerging. The last thing that I thought I might just mention very quickly, and perhaps we can pick up on this over the next while, is that as the United States experienced these sorts of problems, my own sense is that it's likely to actually make more use of another one of its greatest assets, or two of its greatest assets. One is the informational space, of course, but it will be much more aligned with even more active mobilization of its network of agents and operatives right across the world. It's had 70 years to build up this incredible network, right? And many decades of practical experience in destabilizations, regime changes, sabotage, terror, and as its manufacturing system can't keep up with the depletion of weapons in Iran and other parts of the world, there's one thing that it does still have up its sleeve, and that is a vast network of state-sanctioned terror operatives to call upon. And regions across the world, I think, need to be even more on watch for an America that goes rogue than they have ever been before.
Well, I mean, that's essentially what U.S. did in Hong Kong during the Hong Kong protests. They reactivated all their Cold War assets, but that ended up being, most of that network has been uprooted from Hong Kong, got exposed and uprooted, which, if you think about it, those assets has been built up, took decades to build up throughout the Cold War, and now it was thrown away in just one moment. It did cause a bit of a headache for Beijing, but after now I think there's I just don't see any possibility where they can seriously challenge the PRC authority in Hong Kong anymore.
Yeah, look,
So I don't.
well, the lesson is of course all the other smaller countries. But you're dead right. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from Hong Kong for countries, and even in other parts of the world, right? Georgia was a case last year, and this is where I think greater effort is going to be needed, because the conventional military is experiencing a certain kind of relative depletion doesn't mean that the United States and its current generation of political elites and the political culture that operates there will somehow sort of say, well, look, I suppose that's how it is, and we're going to transform ourselves into a normal country, as opposed to being a country that needs to be exceptional and entitled.
Okay. Well, that's on that happy note. I guess we can wrap it up today. Dr. Powell, if people want to follow your work, where would they go?
I'll mention three things. I'm slowly getting better at this. Substack, warwickpowell.substack.com. My own little channel, mainly academics talking about global South issues. Just look me up on YouTube and you'll probably find me. And I'll give a plug for a couple of books though. So this is the main one.
Nice.
Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters. It arrived while I was away, so I finally got to actually see it for the first time. And that's on Amazon. That's the heavier going one. But I also wrote a companion book, which is a little one called The Provenance Economy, which is a little thin handbook, which is much more about how countries and regions and policymakers and enterprises and executives and others who are interested in the practical implementation issues, they can also grab that little handbook in a sense, and that's probably more geared towards doers rather than talkers and thinkers. So and both of those books are available on Amazon now.
Lovely. Everyone give Dr. Warwick Powell a follow, check out his books, and thanks for listening. Until next time. Bye-bye.